This story is based on real historical records, survivor testimonies, and documented wartime archives.
My trade was in demand. That is how I came to be a machinist on a submarine. Not patriotism, not adventure, not anything that sounds good when you tell it afterward. The U-boats needed men who understood engines. And I understood engines. I had worked with diesel machinery since I was old enough to hold a wrench. When I volunteered in 1942 and told them my background, the petty officer barely looked up from his papers. He wrote something down and sent me to Pillau for submarine school. The training was hard. 3 months of classroom work. Systems, pressures, emergency procedures, the behavior of diesel engines under conditions that no land mechanic would ever encounter. Crash dives, depth maneuvers, the particular properties of machinery that must work correctly, not in a well-lit shop with parts on a shelf nearby, but in a sealed metal tube 60 meters below the surface of the Atlantic with men's lives depending on whether the shaft seal holds. You do not approach that kind of work the same way you approach other work. There is no calling for help. There is no closing time. I was sent to Lorient in late August of 1943. Lorient was one of the great U-boat bases on the French Atlantic coast, a city that had been bombed to near rubble by Allied aircraft, but whose submarine pens were still intact. Massive concrete shelters, 30 meters thick at the crown, built to survive anything that could be dropped from the air. The bombs had shattered every civilian building in the city. The pens stood. The boats continued to sail. That contrast told you something about the nature of the war you were entering. My boat was a Type IXC. The IXC was the longer-range variant, designed for extended operations in the South Atlantic and the Caribbean, capable of carrying more fuel and more torpedoes than the shorter Type 7. She was 68 meters from bow to stern, with a pressure hull that could hold against the sea at depths that would crush most structures built by human hands. She weighed over 1,100 tons when surfaced. In the engine room, she weighed everything. The engine room was my world for the duration of each patrol. It occupied a section of the submarine roughly amidships, aft of the control room, forward of the electric motor room. 2 AMA 9-cylinder diesels filled most of the available space, each one taller than a man, each cylinder the circumference of a rain barrel, the whole assembly vibrating constantly when running with a sound that was less noise than it was a physical presence, a pressure in the chest, a hum that settled into you after the first hour and never quite left, not even when the engines were stopped. On the surface, the diesels ran everything. They drove the propellers directly, and they charged the battery banks that powered the boat underwater. When you were running on the surface, the engine room was an inferno. The heat from the engines had nowhere to go. The air was thick with the smell of diesel exhaust and machine oil, a smell so specific that years later, in an ordinary garage, a whiff of certain oils could still put you back there in an instant. The men usually wore only shorts and sandals in the engine room when running diesels. Some did not wear shirts. You drank as much water as you could find, and sweated it out as fast as you drank it. When the dive alarm sounded, everything changed in seconds. The order was alarm, and the response was automatic, trained so deep that the body moved before the mind processed the word. The diesel engines were cut, the electric clutch engaged, the batteries took over. The diesels, which a moment before had been running at high speed, were shut off and sealed, their air intakes locked against the sea. The transition from diesel to electric power happened in a matter of seconds, and had to happen correctly every time without error or hesitation, because the boat was already going down. My job in those seconds was to verify the engine status, confirm the diesels were shut and sealed, confirm the electric motors had picked up the load, check the pressure readings on the hull penetrations. These checks took perhaps 30 seconds in total, but I did them every time, whether it was a training dive or a combat dive, whether I was tired or alert, whether the alarm had come in the middle of the night or in daylight. 30 seconds, the same sequence, every time. Because the one time you skipped it was the one time it would matter. A patrol typically began with a transit through the Bay of Biscay, the water between the French coast and England. And this was already among the most dangerous parts of the journey. By 1943, the Allies had covered the bay with aircraft. British and American patrol planes, Sunderlands and Liberators and others, flew circuits over the water day and night looking for the silhouette of a surfaced U-boat. If they found one, they attacked without warning, dropping depth bombs from low altitude while the boat was still on the surface and her crew was still trying to get below. A submarine is most vulnerable when it is neither fully on the surface nor fully submerged. The crash dive took roughly 30 seconds from alarm to sealed. Those 30 seconds were when you could be killed. The U-boats were modified to fight back. Anti-aircraft guns added to the conning tower, deck armament improved. For a period in 1943, some boats tried to stay on the surface and fight aircraft directly, reasoning that if they could not avoid being found, they might as well shoot back. This rarely worked. Aircraft were faster and could attack from angles the deck guns could not follow. The U-boats that fought on the surface were generally the U-boats that did not come home. You learned to understand the sounds of a patrol, the sound of the surface watch coming below quickly, the different quality of hurried boots on the ladder told you something was happening before any alarm was given. The sound of the orders from the control room filtered through the length of the boat, not the words always, but the tone, the speed of the voice. An experienced crew could hear the difference between a routine dive and a dive that meant something was already above them. I had been on the boat for 3 weeks when I first heard the second kind. I will tell you what a depth charge sounds like from inside a submarine, because it is not what you imagine. You imagine an explosion, a sharp concussion, something. What you actually hear, what you feel, because here is not quite the right word, is a pressure change. The hull absorbs it. The boat shudders, not violently, not the way a building shudders in an earthquake, but with a kind of deliberate, solid transmission of force through every welded seam and riveted bracket. The gauges jump. A pipe fitting somewhere in the engine room will tick. The light fixtures swing slightly on their mounts. If the charge is close, you hear what I can only describe as a ringing, like an enormous bell struck somewhere outside. The tone decaying slowly through the water. The hull metal carries the sound directly into the soles of your feet. If the charge is very close, the boat moves. Not the subtle movement of the sea against the hull, but a sharp lateral displacement. A kick, as though something has struck the side of the pressure hull from outside. Cork insulation drops from the overhead. Seams leak. The lights go out or flicker. The electric motors, running at low speed to reduce noise, absorb the shock through the drive shafts, and you can feel it in the motor room. When the attack began, my job became to listen to the machinery and report what I heard. Not to the bridge. There was no bridge, we were 60 meters down. But to the engineering officer who stood near me in the narrow corridor between the diesels and reported forward to the commander. The diesels were secured and silent. The electric motors ran as slowly as they could. Every man on the boat was still. Noise discipline when hunted was absolute. No unnecessary movement. No tools set down carelessly on metal surfaces. No conversation. The boat was held at depth, and we waited. The destroyers above circled. You could hear them through the hull, the distinctive whipping noise of their propellers, the high-speed rotation of the hydrophone-equipped craft moving at speed, then slowing, then moving again as they searched for the echo that would tell them where we were. When the propeller noise accelerated, when you could hear the rhythm change to the fast driving beat of a warship increasing to attack speed, you knew another charge was coming. There was nothing to do but wait and listen and keep the machinery running. The machinists and motor technicians were the men who made that waiting possible. Not heroically. It was not a heroic thing in any presentable sense. It was a technical thing. The electric motors had to run at exactly the right speed to maintain depth without making noise that the hydrophones above could pick up. If the motors ran too fast, they created a signature the enemy could track. If they ran too slowly, the boat could not be controlled. The correct speed was a judgment that required understanding the motors, their tolerances, their behavior under load, their response to emergency demands. A machinist who had worked with those motors understood that judgment in his hands and his body, not just in his head. The batteries that powered the electric motors had a finite charge. Every hour at depth, every mile maneuvered, every emergency move to avoid a charge pattern cost something from that bank of cells beneath the decking. When the battery was depleted, the boat had to surface to recharge. If you surfaced while the destroyers were still above you, the boat was almost certainly lost. The calculation that governed everything during a depth charge attack was therefore how much charge remained, how long we had been under, how long we could remain under, and what the odds were that the enemy would still be there when the battery demanded we surface. That calculation was never precise, It was a judgment made by the commander from incomplete information. But the machinist's reading of the battery status, the motor temperatures, the cooling water temperatures, the condition of the equipment, all of that fed into the judgment. I reported to the engineering officer every 15 minutes during an attack. Status of main batteries. Status of motors. Estimated remaining endurance. These reports went to the commander in the control room. The commander made his decision. We lived or we did not. Peter Peterson, a sailor who survived multiple patrols including a depth charge attack by 6 American destroyers in 1943, described it afterward in the plainest possible terms. They were caught and went deep, he said, and the destroyers made run after run on them for hours. Explosions all around. There was nothing they could do about it. They had to take it. That phrase, "we had to take it," is the most accurate description I have encountered of what depth charging feels like from below. You are passive. You cannot run faster than the destroyers above. You cannot shoot back from 60 meters down. You reduce your noise signature, and you maneuver as quietly as you can, and you wait for them to lose the contact or run low on charges. And you endure whatever comes in the meantime. You endure it, and then you check your gauges, and then you make your report. By the late summer and autumn of 1943, the calculus of the Atlantic War had changed in ways that the men on patrol could feel even without being told the aggregate numbers. What we knew was personal. We knew that boats that had sailed with us from Lorient were not coming back. You could feel the gaps in the personnel rosters when boats came in from patrol and then went out again and did not return. The pens at Lorient were always busy, boats being repaired, loaded, repainted, but the quality of the busyness changed. Less celebration for returning boats, more quiet, more of the particular silence that accumulates around the absence of men who had been present and then were not. What we did not know, could not know at the time, was the full scale of what was happening. In May of 1943, the U-boat arm lost 43 boats in a single month, 25% of the operational force. Not since the beginning of the war had losses approached anything like this. Grand Admiral Donitz, who commanded the U-boat force, and whose own son was lost aboard U-954 in that month, withdrew the boats from the North Atlantic in the last week of May and called off the campaign. He called May 1943 the month of the greatest crisis in the U-boat war. Others would later call it the Stalingrad of the U-boat arm. The comparison was not inaccurate. Like Stalingrad, it was the moment when a force that had been advancing confronted the limit of what it could do against an enemy that had accumulated greater strength. The figures behind that loss were precise. 43 U-boats, 1,832 men dead. 183 men survived those 43 sinkings. The total Kriegsmarine U-boat force would lose over 760 boats during the course of the war, and nearly 27,000 men, a casualty rate of approximately 75%. Of every 4 men who went to sea in a U-boat, 3 did not come back. When I calculate those numbers now, decades after the fact, they still require a moment to absorb. 75%. It means that the statistical expectation for any man who joined a U-boat crew was that he would not survive the war, not that he risked not surviving. That the likelihood was that he would not. The boats that returned to Lorient were the exceptions. The ones at the bottom of the Atlantic were the rule. In 1942, when I was trained, when the U-boat force was still describing itself as the arm that would win the war in the West, these numbers were not yet written. The future always looks different in its own present. But by the autumn of 1943, the arithmetic was becoming visible even to those of us who only saw our own piece of it. Too many boats not returning. Too many new faces coming aboard to replace experienced men who had gone down with other crews. Too many patrols that found no targets because the convoys had been rerouted by intelligence we did not know they possessed. The Allied code breakers at Bletchley Park had been reading the U-boat radio traffic for much of the war. Not always, not continuously, but enough. When they could read it, the convoys were routed away from where we were. When they could not, we found them. The U-boat commanders at sea could not know which situation obtained on any given patrol. We attributed our failures to luck, to weather, to the increasing competence of Allied escorts. We did not know about the room in England where women and men worked in shifts to break the keys that gave away our positions. This is the nature of being a small part of something large. You see your piece of it, the piece that involves your boat, your patrol, your machines. The full picture assembles itself somewhere else, in offices and command posts you will never enter, and is only visible long after the fact. I'm going to tell you about the machinery one more time, because I think it is the thing most poorly understood about what U-boat sailors experienced. When the boat was at depth, under attack, the engine room was sealed and silent. The diesels sat cold and dark. The electric motors ran at minimum speed. The only sounds were the hum of the motors, the occasional click of a pressure gauge needle, the distant working of the hull against the pressure of deep water. The hull of a submarine is not rigid in the way a building is rigid. It yields. At depth, the pressure of 60 or 80 or 100 meters of water presses in against the steel from every side, and the hull responds with minute compressions that you can hear as a very faint, constant sound. A low, continuous creaking, barely audible, a reminder of what was outside. Every machinist developed a relationship with that sound. Not with fear, exactly, though fear was always present. A more practical relationship. The creaking of the hull at depth was normal. The creaking was expected. What you listened for was any change in it, any crack or groan that went beyond the known range, any sound that suggested a seal was failing or a penetration was taking water. Seawater entering a pressure hull at depth does not enter slowly. It enters with enormous force, driven by the pressure differential. A small breach becomes a large breach very quickly. The machinist's job was to hear the difference between the normal sounds of a hull under pressure and the sounds that meant something was wrong, and to report it fast enough to do something about it. You became, over the course of a patrol, very well acquainted with the sounds of your boat. The machinery had personalities, the way any machinery does when you live with it long enough. The port diesel ran slightly warmer than the starboard. One of the electric motors had a bearing that produced a faint vibration at certain speeds. Not a serious vibration, not yet a problem, but a note you learned to recognize. The battery bank in the forward section depleted faster than the readings suggested it should, a quirk that had been noted in the engineering log and reported, but not yet corrected. These things were yours to know. They were the information that made the difference between a report that said systems normal and a report that said something is not right and I cannot tell you yet what it is. That second report was the important one, the one that preceded the problem rather than following it. I survived my patrols. I am writing this, which means I came back. The boat I sailed on went out again after I left it, after a period of repairs and refit that I watched from the pier in Lorient, and it did not come back from that patrol. The men who sailed on that patrol were men I had worked alongside, whose habits I knew, whose voices I could recognize on the intercom in the dark. I learned of the loss months later, through the mechanisms by which such things were communicated in wartime. An official notice, a silence where communication had previously occurred, the name absent from the next roster. I want to say something about what it means to know the machinery of a vessel well, and then to know that the vessel is at the bottom of the ocean. It means something specific that is difficult to articulate. You know the exact sound the diesels made when they were cold started after a long dive. You know the feel of the throttle controls under your hands. You know the smell of the engine room at depth, the particular combination of oil and humidity and metal that was that boat and no other boat. And then that boat is gone. Specifically and irrevocably gone, with every particular thing about it, and the men who knew those things as well as you did are gone with it. The U-boat arm would lose 763 boats before the war ended. Behind each number is a pressure hull at the bottom of an ocean somewhere. Most of them still there. Most of the men inside them still there. The machinery I would have checked and reported on and listened to through 2 months of an Atlantic patrol is still attached to those boats, down in the dark. The gauges I would have read, the bearing with the faint vibration at certain speeds. The Atlantic is very deep in most places. The men who came home were not more skilled or braver than those who did not. They were the ones for whom the numbers happened to come out differently. My trade was in demand until the boats stopped coming back.